I think most of you should know us, given you're in the room, and I see a few familiar faces, so it's great. But for those of you who don't, we're Ireland's leading NGO dedicated to penal reform and systemic change. Our vision is a just, humane Ireland where prison is used as a last resort. And I suppose one of the reasons we wanted to have this event here today was really to try and put a focus on the idea that when people walk through the prison gates, that their rights aren't extinguished, because we aren't a service provider, but we do get calls from people who are in custody, and they seem to think that their rights don't continue to exist while they're inside. And we always tell them that they do. They might be different or they might be limited in some ways, but we want to ensure that people know that they still do have rights while inside. One of the reasons for having this as well is that back in 2012, we would have worked with the Irish Council for Civil Liberties to develop a plain English Know Your Rights booklet around your rights in prison. And we updated that in 2021, and we probably need to update it again. But I suppose we would have sent that booklet out to all the different prisons, to service providers, and it is available for people, but we know that people in the prison system very often have literacy issues. There could be language barriers. So we want to really use today as a way to try and think about how we could do things differently, how we can actually ensure that people inside know what their rights are and know that they can vindicate them. So I also want to just say that this event is kindly funded by IREC, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, their grant scheme for 2023-2024, and that's why it's in such a lovely venue as well. We were delighted to be able to get that and to actually put a bit of focus and attention on that today. We think this event is more important than ever because we are currently in overcrowding crisis across the prison estate. The prisons are operating at 112% capacity. We know that rights that would have been respected and protected in the past are currently under pressure, under threat, with people having to share cells, having to live in conditions that they wouldn't have had to a few years ago. So that's one of the reasons for looking at that as well. Originally, our project was entitled Access to Justice, but anyone we spoke to was like, oh, well, I'm not a lawyer, I can't talk about that. And we were like, well, no, it's not about that piece. It is about the information, the remedies and advocacy. So hence we changed the title, but that is really what it's about, I suppose. And we have a fantastic lineup of speakers here today with us. We were delighted that everyone we asked accepted. So we are going to try to keep to time, and I'm going to hand over to James now. We do have, we are fully subscribed, and I think people will come in during the day as well. Some people will have to leave, that's absolutely fine. We are recording the session, just to flag that, so it will be made available afterwards. But I'm delighted that I don't have to do all the usual MC chairing stuff. So I'll introduce James now and I can sit down and relax for a little while. But James Leonard, for anyone who doesn't know him, he is an expert by experience and an award-winning podcaster. He's appeared on the Tommy Tiernan Show, speaking about his first-hand experience with addiction in the criminal justice system, and has since spoken on the Late Late Show, Primetime, and other TV and radio shows. James has worked in the areas of education, youth work, homelessness, addiction and community health. He is an award-winning podcaster and is a full-time PhD student in University College Cork, and we are delighted to have him here today to MC this day for us, and he will be joining me on a panel later this afternoon as well. So James, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Hello, it's great to be here. Thanks for the introduction. I always get a little bit uncomfortable when people are introducing me, it's easier to take the criticism than the appreciation, but it's great to be here. It was an honour to be asked to do it actually, because over the last few years I would have used Irish Penal Reform Trust research and our website for assignments and research and guest podcasts and just becoming informed in the area, For the people that don't know me, I'm from Cork City, in case you didn't guess with the accent. I have lived experience of prison like some other people in the room, but by the grace of God we were able to survive it, and at the moment I'm just starting a full-time PhD. My research is around prison education and people's experience of education, people that have been in prison when they get out of prison. So if anybody is interested in that, make sure to connect with me afterwards. As I said, I do podcasts. I like interviewing people. We were able to show the interviews on the Prison TV channel. That's a great resource that we can access all the prisoners in Ireland at the same time with one video, do you know what I mean? So it's a great opportunity, and hopefully they'll get to see this as well. I think it'd be beneficial. Just before we start, I remember when I was first kind of dipping my toe into the water of this type of stuff, you know. Sheila used to bring me along to conferences and be introduced to different people, you know. And a few years later, I'm the MC of the conference, you know. But I never imagined, because I would be so shy and sheepish at the back of the room, you know. But it just shows like you develop in many ways, you know. So I remember I interviewed Gabor Mate once, and when I was doing the introductions, then I said to him, we might as well horse into it, so Gabor, and he didn't know what he was talking about. But you'll know, we might as well horse into it. But I'm going to introduce the lovely panellists. I let every panellist speak for 5 or 10 minutes. Then we'll have questions and reflections, and hopefully you'll be full of the joys of life for that. So the first person on the list is Gemma Culleton, Prisons Information Officer, Citizens Information. Gemma is an Information Officer, South Leinster Citizens Information Service. She's been delivering prison inreach in the Midlands and Portlaoise Prison since 2000, and was officially appointed Prisons Information Officer in 2020. In that role, she continues her work with people in prison and also supports the developments of the Citizens Information Service in other prisons around the country through the IPRT working group. Gemma's background is in nursing and counselling and psychotherapy. Gemma actually trained to be a nurse in this building. So full circle moment there. Christopher Bowes is the legal officer at the Free Legal Advice Centre, FLAC. Christopher undertakes FLAC's policy and research work in the areas of legal aid, social welfare, housing and equality law. He was previously project coordinator of the Equality Action Project, a joint project of IREC and FLAC, which aimed at strengthening civil society engagement with the review of Ireland's equality legislation. He was called to the bar in 2020. Well done, Christopher. Dr. Amina Adanan, lecturer, assistant professor in law, Maynooth University. Dr. Amina is lecturer in Maynooth University. Her research areas include how international law applies in domestic legal systems and human rights. She co-authored Irish Penal Reform Trust 2020 research on the rights and experiences of minority ethnic groups in the Irish penal system, and is the sole author of a forthcoming IPRT report on public interest prison law in Ireland, which will be launched next month. So well done on that. Paula, Kearney, BRIO coordinator at the SAOL project. Paula is the community development worker and activist from the North Inner City Dublin. She's currently BRIO team leader with the SAOL project, where she actively engages in developing the strengths of people who use drugs with a focus on peer participation. Paula has a passion for working with people who use drugs and has been active in campaigns to change drug policies, such as the decriminalisation of drugs for personal use. And last but not least is Darina Ryan-Pilkington, Risk and Compliance Manager in the Irish Prison Service. She joined in 2020 in the height of COVID, and I thought that might be a baptism of fire, but apparently the jails were empty, so it was easier. Prior to that, Darina has worked in the areas of audit and data protection in the private sector. So first on the panel, I'm going to go to Gemma.
Gemma Culleton is my name, and I'm the Prisons Information Officer with South Leinster Citizens Information Service. I feel honoured to be here today, and I'm very grateful to the Irish Penal Reform Trust for inviting me. I'm with the CIS since 1997, and the bulk of my work during that period has been prisons related. Our prison inreach project in the Midlands prison began in the year 2001. We set out to provide a free, confidential, impartial and independent information and advocacy service in a prison setting, with the aim of bringing our service to the people in prison, because for obvious reasons they couldn't come to us. The service is provided weekly, in person, without the use of a phone and no access to online or printing facilities. A former governor in the Midlands prison once described our service, and I quote, as the prisoner's link with the outside world. I clearly understand now why people in prison need a link like the CIS to link them with the outside world. Advocacy is a major part of our prison work, and it's not because the people in prison present with unusually complex queries, but because a person in prison cannot directly access a response or an outcome to a query for themselves. So looking at the theme of accessing information while in prison from a citizen's information perspective, I'm focusing on accessing outside state services and other vital services for information and assistance while one is serving a prison sentence. We all know that information is power. If you or I need to get information to clarify our rights or entitlements, or we need to contact a vital service provider to deal with a personal matter, we have clear access options available to us by phone, in person, or online. It feels good to be able to represent ourselves in society, and it gives us a sense of personal power and satisfaction. So what is it like for people in prison when they need to access information or assistance from outside services? Well, they cannot call in person to the service provider's office. They can phone, but their call may be limited to 6 minutes. And access via email is not generally available to people in prison. Working with this group of people has shown me that they are actually forgotten about in the planning of how state services and other vital services are accessed. So when I need to phone a public service on behalf of one of my clients in the prison, I regularly encounter public service providers who say things like, well, can you ask your client to phone us, please? Or ask your client to go online and renew their license. There is a total lack of awareness of the reality of life for people in prison. As a service provider trying to meet the information needs of people in prison, I am continually seeking ad hoc ways to overcome this lack of both policy and consideration. South Leinster Citizens Information Service completed a prison research project in 2022 in an effort to capture the actual experience of people in the Midlands prison as they try to access information and assistance from outside services on personal matters such as banking, renewing documentation, social welfare, taxation, immigration, and much more. All of these are very real and relevant issues for people who are in prison, just as they are for people on the outside. I'm now going to share with you some of the findings from this research project, giving you the opportunity to hear from the perspective of people in prison what it is like trying to access information and assistance from outside services. Our research contained 5 key research questions. Firstly, we asked the participants, did they think it was important that they had access to information and assistance from outside services while they were in prison? All of the research participants felt access to information and assistance from outside services was vitally important to them. They said, well, we are still human beings and we will be released someday and we will have to reintegrate into society. And if you don't keep things up to date, it can cause an awful lot of hassle for you when you get out. You may find your bank account might be closed due to inactivity, or your medical card or your public service card might have expired. There might be allowances made for you, but you worry about things like that in here. We then asked participants if they experienced any barriers when they tried to access an outside service while in prison. A brief summary of their responses: it was difficult not knowing where to go for the information I needed, and very difficult to validate my identity when writing from prison with no personal documentation to hand. Lack of direct access to the services in question and delays in getting information into prison make life very difficult. It can take weeks to get a question answered. Another said, I can't send an email. I can't phone the bank as I would be cut off after 6 minutes, and that would be embarrassing. And obviously I can't go to the bank in person. We then asked the participants how the barriers to accessing outside services made them feel. They listed feeling very strong emotions such as anger and fear, panic, frustration and stress. For example, they stated, I'm feeling bad that I can't do this for myself, and I'm feeling guilty about having to ask my mother for help. She's had enough to deal with. I feel angry that I can't help myself, and I'm struggling with this. What do I do now? I'm stuck in here. And the pressure of it all, and a sense of having no control. I don't know where to turn to. We then asked the participants to list the people they would feel confident in turning to for help in trying to access information while in prison. And they mentioned the class officer and the chaplains, governors, prison officers, teachers, resettlement coordinators, training and employment officers, ISM officers, medical and counselling staff. So they would feel confident in really turning to anybody in the prison service. And some of their responses, well, I asked the ISM officer. She wasn't sure, so she suggested I ask the class officer. I asked the addiction counsellor, and he suggested I ask the resettlement coordinator. I asked an officer and the lad I was sharing the cell with for a bit of advice, and both recommended I put my name down for the citizens' information. I didn't know where else to turn. So I think it's fair to say that these responses suggest that even the prison staff are unsure as to how the people in their care should access information or assistance from outside services. Finally, we asked the research participants for suggestions on how access to outside services could be improved upon for those serving time in prison. They suggested organised programmes where outside services are readily available to people in prison, like they have in the open prisons. That was a very positive experience for me, and it prepared me for re-entering society. Another said, I began this sentence in a different prison, and there you could have access to a small amount of stuff on the computers. The officers would supervise. For example, you could ask to look up legal aid, and you could get the phone number, and you could get the address, and you could print off the application form. Participants pointed out that the use of the phone in prison is very limited, so maybe that could be improved upon. Another said outside services should have an office in the prison so we can access their service. They should send in a staff member to help us. We can't go to them, so maybe if they came to us. One participant felt it is up to prison management to come up with a solution to this problem, as I am in their care. 2 interviews with senior prison staff and a further 2 interviews with people who have served time in the Irish prison system validated the experiences of those who took part in this research. And my personal experience providing an in-reach service to the people in the Midlands prison for over 23 years also validates the experiences described by participants in the research project. I think it's fair to say that policymakers need to be more mindful of the reality of life in prison and the rights of this community to equality of access to state services and other vital services. I have witnessed positive changes in policy over the last few years. Since November 2018, people who qualify for the state pension contributory can now receive that payment while they're in prison. If they don't have an agent to collect the pension for them at the local post office on the outside, the pension can be paid into a bank account. However, some applicants for the state pension contributory found that their bank account had been closed due to inactivity. Reactivating the account or opening a new account proved to be very difficult or indeed even impossible. Through negotiation, we forged a workable solution with a local bank in Portlaoise, and accounts were opened for people in prison who had a verifiable need for an account to be opened. This involved an awful lot of groundwork, to be fair. Just recently, the Banking Culture Board and the IPS have agreed a policy around the opening of bank accounts for people in prison. And while this is real progress, the practical issues involved around getting the application form, completing the application form, verifying your identity, and eventually accessing the account remain complicated and difficult, to say the least. More attention to how such processes will work on the ground is really needed. Convoluted and complex procedures just deter people from trying to access services. People in prison have human rights which must be respected despite the removal of their liberty. And they are acutely aware of the need to have their official paperwork and services in order so that their transition back into society is not needlessly complex. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Gemma. Do you know if somebody was being released from a prison and they were going back into a rural community where maybe there isn't a whole lot of services, but there might be citizens' information, can they follow up there for advocacy and support?
Absolutely. Part of our role in the Midlands prison would be to provide assistance at the pre-release programmes, and we would always encourage people who are soon to be released that when they are released and are finding that they're a little bit confused about their rights or entitlements, to make sure they go to Citizens Information Service, the local Citizens Information Service, for assistance and help.
Yeah, excellent.
Absolutely, James, yeah.
Excellent. Because, like, if you're going home to Limerick or Cork or Dublin, you have a lot more services than they say you're going home to Galway or Mayo or Sligo or wherever.
Yeah.
Is there any like strategies that have stood out, maybe innovative or creative strategies that you've done or you're working on? Or?
I suppose the banking one that I mentioned there, I'm delighted to see that there is a policy. But as I said, you see, these policies are wonderful, but you need to have a procedure on the ground for the policy to work. You can create a policy here, but how does it work on the ground for people who are in prison who don't know where to turn to? So I think really to work on the ground with people and work out the nitty-gritty of how it's going to pan out is so important.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. Listen, thanks for your time, and we'll let the audience ask you a couple of questions in a minute. But if you pass the mic to your left, please.
Yep.
So, Christopher Bowes from Free Legal Advice Centre.
Hi everyone. So FLAC would like to thank the IPRT for inviting us to participate in this event, and it's really great to see the interest in access to justice issues, and indeed to see this event focus on access to justice. And today I'm going to talk about FLAC's understanding of access to justice, and in particular what that understanding means in practical terms, and in particular then for people in prison and their ability to access information, advocacy and remedies. So in particular, I'm going to draw from FLAC's recent submission to the ongoing review of Ireland's civil legal aid scheme, and I'm also going to draw from FLAC's first-hand experience providing legal assistance to people in communities who experience discrimination and disadvantage. So just to give a bit of background, FLAC, the Free Legal Advice Centre, is an independent human rights and equality organisation, and we've been promoting access to justice in Ireland for 55 years. So we now do this in a number of different ways. So FLAC operates a telephone information line and phone legal advice clinics where people can receive legal advice from volunteer barristers and solicitors. We also operate an independent law centre which takes on a number of public interest cases every year, and those cases are mainly in the areas of housing and homelessness, equality and anti-discrimination, and social welfare law. And that independent law centre also operates a number of dedicated and specialised legal services. So we operate a traveller legal service, a Roma legal clinic and an LGBTQI legal clinic. And based on all those different ways that we provide legal assistance, we draw from that experience in our policy and research work, which makes recommendations for reform, including in the area of civil legal aid and public legal assistance. And we work in a number of different ways because we have a multifaceted understanding of the right of access to justice. So people often think of access to justice as a right to legal aid or legal representation, but we think of it as a multifaceted right. In fact, you can think of access to justice as the outcome, and there are a number of different ways of achieving that outcome. So the right of access to justice actually encompasses or requires access to legal information, advice and advocacy, but also access to and accessibility of the courts and the tribunals, fair procedures, effective remedies, just outcomes, and fair and just laws. So the renaming of this event, which Saoirse mentioned, from access to justice to information, advocacy, and remedies, actually really reflects that multifaceted or broader understanding of access to justice. And as I mentioned, access to justice is a human right, and it's protected in law, including international and national legal instruments. But it's also vital to allow people to realise their other rights, including some of the most basic human rights. And in addition to looking at access to justice as a right, it also has social and economic aspects. So access to justice and measures to promote access to justice can be used as a tool to combat discrimination, poverty, disadvantage, and social exclusion. It's also, research in the UK has shown that people who are able to access those sort of services, it can be linked to improved health incomes. And I think of particular relevance, the organisation, the Public Interest Law Clearinghouse, has highlighted the role of adequate and targeted free legal assistance in breaking the cycle between disadvantage and imprisonment. And that's a theme I might return to towards the end. So this broader understanding of access to justice underpins FLAC's vision for what Ireland's system of public legal assistance should look like. And as I said, we campaign for a system which is outcome focused, which starts with prevention by providing early and timely information and advice, also provides public legal education, advocacy and training, so a number of different services. And it should have timely resolution as its goal, and views litigation as a vital and necessary but last resort. And I was really struck by what Gemma said about the expansion of contributory pensions to people who are in prison to ensure that they're able to access them. I think that change came about on foot of litigation. It was the PC case in the Supreme Court, but it's really interesting to hear that in order for people to be able to get the benefit of that change in the law in practical terms, they required the access to information, advice and advocacy, which the CIB was able to provide. So I think that's a real practical illustration of how access to justice requires access to more than one service and how we need to look at it in various different ways. So ultimately, for people to be able to access justice, the system of public legal assistance should equip them with 4 basic tools. So the first is awareness of their rights. The second is awareness of ways to avoid legal problems or to resolve them in a timely way. The third is the ability to effectively use court and non-court dispute resolution systems. And finally, people should be able to effectively participate in those resolution processes and use them to achieve just outcomes. So that's a sort of high-level understanding of what the system of public legal assistance should look like in our view. And what I'm going to do now is to look at some of the more practical elements of that system with a focus on how it could identify and respond to the legal needs of people in prison. So I'll start with that, identifying legal needs. So we believe that the system of public legal assistance should proactively measure legal need. Ireland is one of very few OECD countries which doesn't measure legal need or legal capabilities. And legal capabilities is what we refer to as the knowledge and competence needed to cope with day-to-day legal situations. Now, we don't need to reinvent the wheel to engage in these sorts of legal need survey systems. There's authoritative and detailed guidelines, and there's a detailed manual on measuring known and unknown legal need, which has been produced by Pascoe Pleasance and the Open Society. So, as I said, many other countries measure legal need, and what legal need surveys in other jurisdictions have shown is that legal problems aren't randomly distributed across the population. They disproportionately affect people in communities experiencing disadvantage, and those groups experience legal problems in a different way. So they're less likely than the general population to experience just one discrete problem which they recognise as a legal issue. Rather, they're more likely to simultaneously or at the same time experience multiple interrelated problems, a number of which may have a legal solution, as well as the knock-on effects of those problems, which can include death, debt, stress, and other health issues. So this is known as clustered injustice, is what it's referred to. So people in prison, we believe, experience a specific form of clustered injustice, where a criminal legal problem or conviction may have knock-on effects, and it can also trigger further legal problems. So the Legal Services Research Centre in the UK has found that levels of social exclusion and clustering of justiciable problems were extremely high amongst the prison population, who also had low levels of understanding of how the legal systems and its processes operated and how it could assist them. So we can think of the legal need of people in prison in 3 different ways. There's obviously a criminal legal issue to begin with, but then you can also have issues in relation to imprisonment itself, for example, in relation to prison disciplinary processes. But you can also have other civil issues, such as in the area of family law, childcare, social welfare, and credit and debt issues. And these may be triggered or exacerbated by imprisonment or linked to the underlying disadvantage which may exist in any given case. So once you've identified legal need and the type of legal need you're dealing with, the system of public legal assistance needs to be responsive to it. And as I said earlier, in the first instance, the focus should be on early and preventative forms of legal information or legal assistance, which includes information, advice, and advocacy. And that's very much the type of work which Gemma and her colleagues are engaged in. So there are benefits to these forms of legal assistance. They can prevent the problem from arising to begin with, and they can also prevent the problem from escalating or resulting in litigation. And it also means that the knock-on effects of experiencing a legal problem, which I mentioned earlier, can be avoided, which is obviously beneficial to the individual, but also can create a saving to the state in that they don't have to deal with those knock-on problems in areas like health and housing, but also because providing legal information and legal advice in the first instance is far less costly than providing representation in litigation. So that's one of the economic benefits or economic aspects of the right of access to justice. So for any form of legal assistance to be effective, they have to be accessible, and particularly to people who are most likely to experience legal problems and clusters in justice. So those are the people in communities who are experiencing discrimination and disadvantage. And those groups are less likely to seek legal assistance or to even think of their problems as legal problems which can be resolved through a legal dispute resolution process. So for example, FLAC is aware that people who are experiencing poverty and disadvantage don't typically contact our phone line or seek to access our free legal advice clinics. However, we do provide a number of targeted legal assistance services, as I mentioned, including the services for the Traveller, Roma and LGBTQI communities. And also in collaboration with the Irish Network Against Racism, we've provided anti-racism advocacy training directly to advocates who work with members of minority, ethnic and migrant communities. And from this experience, we've identified a number of important factors for providing effective targeted legal assistance. And the first is collaboration. Collaboration with other services that targeted groups already engage with. So this can include community and representative organisations, but it can also mean health and welfare services. The second factor is to tailor the services to the specific legal needs and of the group, as well as to the settings in which they live. And the third is outreach and proactive approaches to the identification of legal need. So these factors are also evidenced in the best practice models for the provision of preventative justice services which have emerged internationally. So to just discuss some examples of co-location and outreach, the Homeless Persons Legal Service in New South Wales, Australia operates free legal advice clinics in partnerships with the welfare agencies who provide direct services such as food and accommodation. There's also an emerging body of research and examples of the benefits of so-called health justice partnerships, and that's where medical and free legal services co-locate together, so they're provided in the same location. And increasingly, these collaborative service delivery models use a tool called the Legal Health Check. And this is an accessible survey which allows non-legal professionals, such as outreach workers, to ask the right questions to identify legal needs while they provide other services. And we hope that these examples and principles, which are discussed in more detail, as I said, in FLAC's submission to the current review of civil legal aid, could be instructive if we're thinking about designing an enhanced systems of legal assistance and legal assistance services for people who are in prison. So I mentioned earlier that the experience of imprisonment can actually exacerbate or create new civil legal problems. But it's important to highlight as well that bodies like the Law and Justice Foundation in New South Wales have highlighted that incarceration can also be a circuit breaker for many of the legal issues that prisoners face. Effective services and custodial systems that address legal as well as other common issues, such as in the area of health, can play a significant role in reducing recidivism, or repeat offending because I can't say recidivism. FLAC has emphasised that the need for a conceptual shift, as I mentioned earlier, where we look at public legal assistance as a public services like health or education. And there are echoes of this in a landmark review of access to justice in Australia, which was published in 2018, which found that health, addiction and education services are most commonly cited as the most common factor in preventing repeat offending. However, it is just as vital that a prisoner's legal issues are optimally addressed prior to release. So rethinking legal assistance and access to justice as a public service, which people have a right to access in the same way as they can access health and education services. So just to conclude then, to achieve this, I think there's a particular immediate need for an assessment of the legal needs of people in prison in Ireland. And I mentioned a number of ways in which that can be done, including through surveys and legal health checks. And then the development of services which respond to that need. And to do that, I think we need greater flexibility and collaboration in the provision of public legal assistance in Ireland. So law reform is needed to achieve that and to address issues such as the limited scope of the scheme of civil legal aid in Ireland, which is also inconsistent with our international and human rights obligations, and to expand the remit of bodies such as the Legal Aid Board and Citizens Information Board to allow them to provide enhanced information, advice and advocacy services. So I'll wrap it up there, and I'm happy to take any questions about this.
It was interesting you spoke about clusters and justice. I was thinking about when we went into the Docus and the ladies in Limerick prison, and maybe Paul will talk about this later, but first you have a criminal offence, but then you have homelessness, social workers, and the whole thing is compounded. So maybe we can touch on that in the questions later on. So next on my list is Dr. Amina Adanan, lecturer and assistant professor of law at Maynooth University. Thank you.
So for this presentation, I'm focusing on two areas. The first is the challenges faced by people in prison who are foreign national prisoners or are from a minority ethnic group. And the second item I'm going to focus on is potential areas for reform that could improve the protection of the rights of people in prison. This presentation is based largely on some of the findings from a report I co-authored with colleagues in the School of Law and Criminology in Maynooth University in 2022, where we researched and analysed the rights and experiences of people from those groups who are in prison. Now that research focused on not only people in penal detention, but also people with experience of the probation services as well. In the interest of time today, I'm going to focus on the research outcomes in relation to people in penal detention. So some of the points and issues that apply, that came out of the research, apply also to the general prison population. It's important to note that particular minority groups, such as foreign national prisoners or persons from minority ethnic background, that they often experience exacerbated barriers due to being in penal detention on account of cultural differences and in particular language barriers as well. In terms of terminology, the term foreign national prisoner is borrowed from the Council of Europe law and policy in this area, and it describes people in penal detention who aren't of Irish nationality. In terms of numbers, according to IPS statistics, in 2022, foreign national prisoners made up 21.5% of the prison population. The European average is around 27%. The term minority ethnic prisoner describes people who are members of a group with a shared culture, tradition, history, language, etc., who are living in a country where most people are from a different ethnic group. So for the research, we combined a kind of a top-down approach where we looked at the law policy that exists in this area on a national, international and European level. And we married that information then with a bottom-up approach where we conducted interviews with rights holders in penal detention and with experience of probation as well. We also conducted 24 interviews with people in prison or experience of probation, and we also conducted 12 professional interviews with stakeholders, so solicitors who work with those groups through the legal system. We interviewed prison staff, prison governors, prison officers, chaplains. We interviewed civil society organisations that work with those groups as well. So one of the challenges faced by foreign national and minority ethnic prisoners was access to information in a language that they understand, and this was a big outcome. Out of those who were interviewed, the vast majority had received a copy of the prison rules and regulations on entry to prison. However, all of those who hadn't received the prison rules and regulations were non-English speakers. And here it's worth pointing out that the UN minimum standards on the treatment of prisoners, more commonly referred to as the Nelson Mandela rules, and the revised European rules as well that come from the Council of Europe framework, they all specify that on entry to prison, people have to be provided with a list of the rules and regulations, their rights and obligations, including the right to legal assistance and advice, and how to make a complaint, and the right to consular assistance where relevant as well. However, our data showed that this right is not always being realised for these groups, particularly for non-English speakers. And one female prisoner interviewed observed, she said, "I didn't know my rights or the rules of the prison either. I didn't know anything. I had to find out from other prisoners that you're not allowed to do this and you're not allowed to do that." Access to translation and interpreters was another barrier faced by non-English speaking people in prison. And in fact, one solicitor that we interviewed spoke about having to go to get the prison rules translated in another language for a client. Indeed, another a rights holder that we interviewed in prison spoke about the difficulties of accessing psychology services by phone without an interpreter during the COVID-19 pandemic. In line with research from other countries, there was evidence of non-English speaking people in prison relying on other prisoners who do speak English to translate information for them, and even to help them communicate with prison officers as well. And we felt that this presents a worrying trend or a worrying scenario in terms of data protection for those individuals who have to rely on the translation skills of other people in prison, and also it places the non-English speaking person in a particularly vulnerable position depending on the power balance between them and whoever is doing the translating for them. The right to communicate with the outside world is of fundamental importance to anybody in prison, particularly important for minority groups whose culture is a minority within the country they're in. In this aspect, we had some interesting findings as well. The first thing to note is that one thing that did come out of the interviews that we did, particularly with those who are foreign national prisoners, where geography and finance were barriers to their family coming to visit them, especially when they're not in the country. One rights holder said, "I'm so far from my family, that's the most difficult thing." Another rights holder spoke of his mother wishing to visit him with his children, but couldn't due to financial, the cost of travel. All of those who we interviewed whose family were in a position to visit from abroad spoke positively of the IPS accommodating a number of visits over a short period of time while their family are visiting, and also being allowed more time than usual during a visit as well. Similarly, the use of video calling, which was introduced during the COVID-19 pandemic, was also spoken of very positively as well. And obviously that's depending on the quality of the phone network in the other country as well. In terms of the relationship between civil society organisations that represent those minority groups and their relationship with the Irish Prison Service, one of the findings that came out of our research was strained relationships between the civil society organisations, in particular those that represent Muslim prisoners and prisoners of African descent as well. And the leaders in those civil society organisations felt that their concerns or the requests that they made to IPS weren't taken seriously by prison staff, and they spoke of difficulties in communication as well. In terms of areas for reform to alleviate this situation, there's a number of points that we made, particularly in our recommendations, which you can read in detail in the report. But just to summarise, one of the main findings for us was the importance of the gathering of data on the ethnic makeup of the prison population. And as far as I understand, the Irish Prison Service does gather that data, but it's not shared publicly. And it's important that it is shared publicly, obviously, for a number of reasons. Firstly, to be able to assess ethnic equality monitoring, to assess if there's any differences in terms of who's accessing services, differences in terms of any differences in terms of the prison disciplinary regime. Is it a case that certain groups are overrepresented in particular disciplinary regime methods? So it's really important that this data is gathered, and this is something, it's not just for the prison service to be more conscious of, it's other public bodies as well in the state, and this is something that has come up when Ireland is reviewed by the UN Committee against the elimination, or for the elimination of racial discrimination. And IREC, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, have also highlighted this on occasion as well. It's really important that data is gathered. In terms of the ongoing review of the prison rules, it's really integral that the full range of rights that are afforded in the Nelson Mandela rules, and importantly in the Council of Europe revised European rules, that as they apply to all prisoners, but specifically minority groups, because there are a range of really important rights that are provided for in particularly the revised prison rules, European prison rules from 2020, and it's really vital that they are incorporated into the prison rules on a domestic level to make them enforceable in the state. Thirdly, we recommended that the Department of Justice and the IPS improve access to interpretation and translation services for non-English speaking prisoners as well. We also recommended the introduction of targeted supports for families travelling from abroad to visit foreign national prisoners. And lastly, I'm sure this will probably come up throughout the day as well, but all people interviewed spoke negatively of the current complaint system, the current prisoner complaint system, and so which obviously is under review at the moment. Really important there that as part of the review that the particular difficulties faced by non-English speaking people in prison are incorporated into improvements into the system. Our interviews demonstrated that the difficulties that non-English speaking people in prison face in terms of trying to access the complaint system, and they spoke of the difficulties of having to write the complaint. So alternatives here need to be incorporated into the review, and maybe things like different methods of making a complaint, so it's not just literary based, especially given the low literary rates among the prison population. So on that note, I'll conclude. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Thank you, Dr. Amina. I often think about ethnic minority prisoners at the moment, especially black and brown prisoners, with the growing rise in racism and far-right sentiment. And maybe we can touch on that in the questions, you know. It's definitely something that inevitably will go into the prison at some stage. So moving on, Paula Kearney from the SAOL project. Thank you, Paula.
Sorry, I talk Northern City Dublin, so if I'm talking too fast, let me know. My name is Paula Kearney. I work with the SAOL project. The SAOL project is a women's recovery programme in the Northern City. We focus on using a community development approach to work with the women, like meeting them where they're at. We don't particularly focus on what drugs they're taking. We try and work on the other issues that are around what's there that's making them use drugs and all. But I do a piece of work with them. I'm the BRIO coordinator, and BRIO stands for Building Recovery Inwards and Outwards, and we work with women who are either have convictions or are on probation or are somewhat justice involved. So a lot of our work focuses on peer work. I think I have one of them down the back there. But yeah, we work with the women, and now at the moment we've no groups at the moment, but we are rebranding BRIO. What we're hoping to do is do like a 3-tier peer programme. So the start of it would be women coming in, and as it says, it's building recovery inwards and outwards. The inwards piece is coming in, personal development, personal growth. What are your strengths? What do you want to do? Do you know, and see what it is that the women are interested in and work on that. And then from then on, then we start to help them become peer facilitators. So if we're doing programmes in SAOL, such as Reduce the Use, Recover Me, which are programmes to help women, support them to help reduce their drug use. Hopefully some women will stop it, but we don't put a focus on what drugs they're taking, as I said, because I think there's an awful fear in drug services of the actual drug, instead of actually looking on what's causing them to use the drugs. So, as I said, the second tier will be to help us facilitate groups in the programme. And then when women do progress into the third tier river, they then come with us to facilitate groups outside. Now that could be in the Docus, because we do run a programme in the Docus. Every Wednesday the SAOL project is in the Docus, but now we do rotate. That'd be the Seek and Safety programme be up there for 10 weeks. The BRIO programme be up there, the Davina programme. So they're all just different programmes within SAOL. I'll explain actually what they are, because people won't know. The Davina programme focuses on women who have substance use and domestic violence in their story. So that's a programme about supporting women on how to identify the risks, how to combat them risks, and how to get the skills to be assertive, to walk away, and to know when they do and don't consent to something. And what was the other one I mentioned? Apologies. I get very nervous talking, sorry. The other programme, Seek and Safety, would be about being trauma informed. You know, helping people to make positive choices in their lives, and about that being in safe spaces. And again, it comes down to the women's abilities, do you know what I mean? Recognising them abilities and helping them to grow it. As I says, we've been going into the Docus doing, and at the moment I'm doing a piece of work in the Docus with the women on human rights and prisoner rights with the BRIO programme. And it was so interesting, like I said, I come from a place of lived experience. Do you know, I've had the lived experience of addiction, I've had the lived experience of prison. And I remember, Jesus, I haven't been 15 years, but still, I remember the difference in education system within the prison. It was always very gendered, you know. You went in, you done a hairdressing course, you done this course, very gendered, like blue for boy, pink for girl type of stuff. But it's great to see that it has moved on. Do you know, that there are programmes going in that focus on what the women want, and as well, like there's a range of, there was Bernardo's go in, the STEPS programme, there's loads of different programmes that go in that are not just focused on what a boy should do, what a girl should do, and sticking to that, but are actually seeing what the women want to get engaged in. So in terms of the education system in it has improved, but there still needs to be a lot more work in it. Like, let's be realistic about it. Yeah, as I said, we're doing a piece on human rights, and we're having a conversation there with the women the other day about, like, do they understand what human rights are, what prisoner rights are? And I remember when I was in prison, if someone come in and asked us that, we wouldn't have a clue. But it is a testament to how advanced the education system has come, that the conversations, like the consciousness, all that was there, do you know what I mean? Conversations were brilliant in it. But one of the conversations did come up about, when you talk about prisoners' rights, about having the right to vote. And they were talking about, yeah, we have the right to vote, but why would we? He says, we'd love to vote, he says, but when it comes to the voting, he says, even though we have that right there, nobody comes in and tells us what someone stands for. He says, so there's no point in handing us a ballot paper when we don't know what their policies are, what their interests are. So we could be voting against something that could be harming us. So there needs to be a lot more work, you know, on that. But as I said, the human rights piece we're doing, we were talking about doing we're doing a few sessions at the start and then doing an art project based. So they're going to develop a prison, what their idea of a prison with the lens of human rights would look like, what it would have in it. And a lot of the things that was coming up was peer-led services, such as, I know they have the listening workers and all in there, but supports for them workers. Because someone mentioned it there earlier about I think it was the Citizens' Voice, that most people in prison actually get their information off other prisoners. But one of the women was talking about how she was supporting another prisoner in it, but when she went up to the prison officer, I was going to say something else, when she went up to the prison officer, it's coming back to me, old me there, so, she was shut down, you know. It was like, just mind your own business, they can come themselves. But this was a person who was terrified, it was her first time in, and rather than thanking the girl for coming and helping and supporting the woman, she was shut down. So that needs to be really, really looked at and really pushed, you know, the value of peer work. Because we just say, when I go into the Docus, I remember the programme that I'm coordinator of now, I was one of the first participants in that programme. So I've come full circle in that, and I remember going into the prison as a peer, you know, and doing that piece of work. And it is the value, like what helped me come through with addiction, what helped me come out of the prison service was actually seeing other people doing it. So I think peer work really, really needs to be pushed and in many ways resourced, you know, because we keep expecting people with lived experience to give their time, to give their stories, and we don't pay them. it's a little thank you or maybe a gift voucher at the end if they're lucky. Do you know, so there needs to be more resources put into them programs because they do work. Do you know, it was mad, I was looking, it was last week I was reading an interview from a fella in America, Cornelius Anderson, and he was a fellow who back in 1999 got a 13-year prison sentence for robbing Burger King or something, but he appealed that and got out on bail. And when he got out on bail, eventually he lost the appeal anyway. So he's sitting in his house waiting on the police to pick him up. Police never came. Months and months went on, so he went on, changed his whole life, started a business, was voting in his own name, the whole lot. It was only when it came to his parole 13 years later that they noticed they had not signed a warrant to actually go and arrest him, and went and arrested him then. But that just shows, though, if people were given alternatives to prison, if people were encouraged, you know, and supported, we may not have overcrowded prisons the way we do now. Do you know, so we do need to start looking at alternatives to prison. So, as this is on the programme anyway that we're doing now, we have, after a lot of conversation yesterday, encouraged the women and asked the chief and that, at the end of this programme, will they come in and let the women do a presentation on the day of the graduation? Now, at first the women were like, what's the point? Nothing will change. It's right, nothing may change, but at least they will hear it's your voice. It's not us telling them. It's your voice telling them. It's yours. All yous at work that you're at the point into it, and it'll be coming from yours. And if nothing changes, at least you can be proud that you stood up and told them what's working and what's not working. So I think that really needs to be encouraged, and I will finish there. Thanks.
Thanks, Paula. It's like investing in recovery is reducing crime as well. There's loads of research that. There's one in Cork, Graham, Cambridge, and he interviewed a lot of people. People that have been in prison that have been affected by addiction, and they are come out was when they got recovery, the offending stopped. Do you know what I mean? And it was kind of, I suppose, eye-opening last year when we had Limerick Prison, the females, no wing opened. Around the same time, Culleton opened the ladies' treatment centre, but that was an old building donated by the Sisters of Mercy, and big magnificent prison then, do you know what I mean? So like, what are we investing in, do you know what I mean? We're like, you're housing women away, and do you know, if you invest in the recovery options, you don't need the new prisons, do you know what I mean? So interesting you spoke about voting rights. I'm part of a transnational organisation, Incarceration Nations Network. One of my friends on that, he's from Washington DC. His name is Joel Castan. Give him a Google. He did 27 years of a life sentence, but he went in as a child and he got out. But they allowed people in Washington DC to vote that were in prison. So he educated himself inside. He mobilised the lads inside. He started doing information sessions. Anyway, he got elected. He ran himself and got elected. He was the first in Washington DC to be elected to public office while being incarcerated. He had his public office on the landing. He had his suit and tie and everything. It's amazing, but you know, when he was talking to me about that, I thought people in Irish prisons couldn't vote. It's like, what's the point? Like, it's no use having a right if you don't know you have the right.
And if you don't know who you're voting for.
Yeah, and I suppose something that we'll come back to, in the void of lack of information, people could be radicalised into thinking that that's the problem, they're against you, do you know what I mean? So that's why maybe we can use a prison TV channel and maybe the Citizens Information come up with some sort of a programme where we can just create an awareness of these are the political parties, these are their ideologies, this is how you register to vote. Because if we can get people that are in prison and they're somewhat stable, and if we can get them to register to vote, we might change the culture of voting within that family. You know what I mean? So, yeah. Last but definitely not least is, thanks for your patience. Yeah. So we have Darina Ryan-Pilkington, Risk and Compliance Manager on the IPS.
Can everybody hear me now? Sorry. My name is Darina Ryan-Pilkington. We've gone from a north inner city accent to a rural south Sligo accent, so bear with me, I also speak very, very fast. As it was mentioned earlier, I joined the prison service back in 2020 during the COVID pandemic, and Are we good? If I wasn't on edge enough before, I certainly am now. During the height of the COVID pandemic, when prisoner numbers were at an all-time low and we were operating with a very restricted regime, I then went and had a baby and had a year-long holiday and came back and was like, whoa, what happened here while I was gone? So as many of you may know, we are currently operating at an overcapacity level of about 5,000 prisoners. Our defined capacity is 4,516 prisoners, which basically means that on any given day we could refill Clover Hill Prison, we could refill Castlereagh Prison, we could fill, I think, if I'm not mistaken, we could probably fill one of the open Lock and House maybe 3 times over. So when we talk about overcapacity, we're not just talking about people on mattresses on the floor, but we're also talking about canteen spaces, psychology spaces, primary healthcare spaces, service provider spaces that are not existing with each prisoner on each mattress, okay? So my role within the prison service started off as a very simple role as the risk and compliance manager, which was to come in and develop a risk management policy, embed risk management within the prison system, create risk registers for a corporate setting, directorate level and headquarters and each of the prisons. And then what happened, miraculously would be one way to describe it, is that somebody decided, oh, she seems to like Excel spreadsheets, so let's give her recommendation tracking from all of our oversight bodies. And now I spend my days usually crying over the emails that Ciara sends me, and trawling through IPRT reports, visiting committee reports, OIP, CPT, and I suppose that gives me the opportunity to have a perspective on oversight for what that's coming into us and also what's happening within the directorates at HQ and also at a prison level. So how would I describe the prison service? So I love an analogy, and I decided that maybe the best way to describe the prison service as at today is if you are getting up in the morning and you are partial to a smoothie. So you have all of your favorite ingredients. You also have all of your ingredients that are required to keep you healthy. And as it stands at the moment, you have like a cup that is, we'll say, a third of the size that you need it to be. And you need to blend all of those components into one smooth, sweet breakfast smoothie, okay? So we have our core services, our safe and secure custody, which means that our prisoners are unlocked in the morning, they're fed, they gain access to primary health care, they gain access to education, they get out of cell time, they get to meet their friends, they get to walk around. That's the core safe and secure custody. And then we need to look at rehabilitation and resettlement. But in an environment where you are over capacity and trying to meet the needs of more prisoners with the core staff for 4,500 prisoners, you're already starting every day at a disadvantage. So I've learned a lot here today from our stakeholders, and I would love to say, I promise that we can do this. I promise that we can deliver on this. I'm going to go away today and I'm going to find 70 squillion euro and I'm going to action all of the points that come up today. But unfortunately, we are really stuck in a firefighting space at the moment, okay? So we're actively engaging with our partners in the Department of Justice. We are working with an overcrowding risk assessment task force. We have stakeholders from prison and HQ levels who are engaging in the department on working groups to identify how we move this forward, how we keep this moving along. We work with the OIP very closely and appreciate all of the support that Ciara and Mark can give us in terms of highlighting our need in terms of where we're at with overcapacity. But we really are every day waking up at a disadvantage when we start and commence operations. So the next piece that I want to touch on, and I've taken down about 107 bullet points, I'd say, while everybody was speaking this morning. So bear with me, I'll try and work through them as quickly as I can. But there are a couple of points that I really want to touch on in terms of explaining the journey that the Irish Prison Service is on. So the first one is governance. And this is my baby as the Risk and Compliance Manager. And the importance of, in order to achieve everything that we want to achieve, making sure that we have adequate underpinning. So there was a conversation earlier from Citizens Information around, are we developing policies that are practical and implementable on the ground? Are we supporting prison management to develop and implement policies that are practical and implementable on the ground? And are we trying to streamline everything we do in a way that makes our operations efficient to allow us the resources to deliver on services and rehabilitation? Okay, so that's the first one, governance. The next one is systems and data. And we touched on data earlier in terms of our ability or willingness to share data. And I suppose it's very important to say that we are on a journey in terms of gathering data. And we are also, I suppose, struggling a little bit in terms of that two-way information sharing piece with our other colleagues in the Department of Justice. So, for example, we talked about prisoners coming into prison and I suppose that feeling of being a deer in headlights. On the flip side, sometimes when prisoners come into prison, our staff are those deer in headlights too, because we don't have enough information about who's coming in, what their needs are, what the risks are that are associated with that person, and how we can best accommodate them in a way to start them off on their rehabilitative journey. So with systems and data, we're working on it, okay? And that's probably the best way to describe it. We're trying to introduce new systems, new mechanisms to enable us to be more efficient in our operations, again, to deliver better rehabilitative services. There's a lot of conversation then about advocacy, access to justice, availability of information, and the good old prisoner TV channel, which could be on round the clock, 24/7, with different modules on it. And I recently spoke at what's called our prisons leadership team about how we can better and more strategically and targetedly communicate with prisoners, because it is one thing that the TV channel is excellent. There are no two ways about it. But there is a point of saturation that will be reached by everyone when every stakeholder that feeds into the prison service is trying to get their piece of information across the line. So there is a very strategic, multidisciplinary, collaborative approach needed to provide information inwards in a way that doesn't leave a prisoner ultimately saturated by the volume, okay? Then I suppose one piece that I often find doesn't come to the fore at settings like this in investigation and oversight reports, and that is our staff. So when we talk about advocacy, the first advocate, the frontline advocate, should be the prison officer, the class officer, the people who are working every day and managing and safe and secure custody and onwards into rehabilitation. So again, to touch on overcrowding, if we have 500 extra prisoners, how are we empowering, or how are we capable of empowering our staff to be that first advocate for prisoners? Okay, so ultimately the challenge that we face is that every single aspiration we have in terms of service delivery is impacted by the fact that we are a prison overcapacity. Okay, so in terms of me standing here today and making promises, in the first instance, we need to be able to humanely house prisoners, provide adequate accommodation. And really, we are stuck at that, I suppose, effectively that square one. Okay, so we're doing everything in our power to move off square one, but at the moment it's very, very difficult. So that's, I think, bullet point number 43. We have a lot of really valued and valuable stakeholders who provide in-reach services to us. And I don't think that anyone would let me leave here today without mentioning the Red Cross, who are absolutely fantastic. And certainly from the point in time when I joined in 2020, during the pandemic, they have been an invaluable service to us. We also have the Samaritans. We have Red Cross Samaritans. We have the peer programs that we have in the prisons, and I know peer programs have been mentioned already. On committal information, or the prison rules and regulations, we've actually just finalised at long last an updated committal information booklet, which has been reviewed for plain English and will be translated in due course. We're actually just engaging translation services on that. But certainly it is something that we're acutely aware of in terms of providing adequate information on committal, because, as I said, that feeling of being a deer in headlights. The complaints, the review of the complaints process, I mean, all I can say on that one is that it's ongoing, but it is something that, as I'm sure everyone in this room is acutely aware of, is probably when I ask staff or colleagues of mine, what are the things that keep you up at night? Certainly the complaints process is something that is to the fore in everybody's mind in terms of improvements that we are aware are needed. I am just working through now strategic inreach, and I think it has been touched on to some extent, but I think is really important for me to also say from an IPS perspective is the alternatives to prison piece. So when a person comes into custody in the IPS, they've already there's several points along the way in terms of their life cycle in the criminal justice system. And we would obviously love to never see them. And we would love that once they go out the door that we never see them again. So we're very much in agreement in terms of nobody wants to see people in custody. And we are doing everything in our power, reasonable and practical at the moment, to try and make sure that when they have finished their stage of their journey with us, that we don't see them again. And then I think I'm flying through my bullet points here, apologies. And yeah, I think I'm almost at an end. The final thing that I would like to say is that we are a body that are subject to extensive oversight. And sometimes so much resourcing goes into our response to oversight that we aren't actually in a position to move forward from the oversight piece. And my background is in audit. I absolutely understand and champion oversight. But I think that what I would really like everybody to take away today from a prison service perspective is that, number one, we are severely over capacity. So we aren't able to move, as I said, off that square one. Number two, our staff are some of the most committed people that you will ever meet. They want to go into work every day. They want to keep prisoners safe. They want to allow people to fulfill their potential. They want people to feel safe, well, and most of all, calm within the prison environment. And then last but not least, that with the bodies that are here today, if there's anything that I can do within my role as I suppose, the Excel spreadsheet coordinator person, which is my formal title, which just rolls off the tongue, then I would be more than happy for anybody who wants to reach out, and any support that we can provide from a HQ level, I'd be happy to coordinate that. Okay, that's a wrap, 107 points later. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Darina. I like the smoothie analogy. I think there's two ways to interpret it, isn't there? There's some people will hear that and they'll think she needs a bigger cup, and other people will say she needs less ingredients, and I'd be the less ingredients. We stop putting people into the cup, and you have a bigger cup. You're going to need a bigger cup down the line. We're not going to build our way out of this problem, and you build prison upon prison, because they do that in other countries, and they're going round in circles. So we do need alternatives to prison, like you mentioned. I suppose one of the things I'd be passionate about, like what Paula as well, is drug policy reform. And I think that is definitely in the interest of the IPS to have a drug policy reform. Heard in a Oireachtas committee recently where Ben Ryan was fielding questions from Lynn Ruane and others, and he was pushing back. And it seems to me that the Gardaí have more of a say in the department with regards to drug policy reform. For example, we know the prisons are overcrowded, and a lot of people in there would be in there for drug offences, and in other jurisdictions they wouldn't be in prison because there would be decriminalisation or legalisation. So if we took a decriminalisation approach, it would take a lot of pressure off the prison service. But then the Gardaí's pushback is we need to be able to stop and search these people for intel. And then you're like, but you can't use vulnerable people for intel. So there's a balance between rights of individuals and security. I suppose that's something that you come across in the prison service all the time. But I wonder, does anybody want to ask a question before I ask a question? Anybody have something really? Yeah. We might get the back there.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for such great presentations, and it's really cool to get such a broad perspective. My name is Darina. I'm from the Ombudsman for Children's Office, and my question is just for Chris. Christopher, yeah, I suppose in my work we would do a lot of education with children and parents around their rights, but often there might not be a place for them to actually go and legally get a remedy or realise their rights in practice, which I thought was really interesting that you mentioned. And I presume it's a big challenge for you as well, to provide access to justice as a public service, kind of like you said, if there's actually no legal remedy in place for certain socioeconomic rights that really affect these populations. So kind of how do you guys tackle that? Do you kind of advocate for more rights to be incorporated into law, or is it more of a kind of political approach? And how do you find that? Thank you.
Hiya, thanks for that. So I think just to start, so FLAC is an independent organisation, so we're an NGO, so we're distinct from the Legal Aid Board, which is the state body that administers the scheme of civil legal aid. So I suppose FLAC, as I said, we provide a number of legal services, and the areas we provide them in, so housing and homelessness, social welfare, equality and discrimination, those would be our main areas where we provide legal representation. The tribunals which hear cases in those areas are typically excluded from the scheme of civil legal aid, and people can't access legal representation before them. So there's a gap in the statutory scheme of civil legal aid, and that's certainly something we're campaigning to be addressed within the current review of civil legal aid. So there's a lack of, so people aren't able to access the legal representation they need before tribunals that deal with socioeconomic rights. So that's a significant issue. The scheme of civil legal aid is largely dominated by the area of family law, and something I'd emphasise as well is the Legal Aid Board's work is focused on legal representation. So these other important areas such as information, advice and advocacy, people aren't able to access the other legal assistance services which might prevent a problem escalating to the extent that they would actually end up needing legal representation in a contentious legal matter. Something I might touch off as well, because I think it's related, is just we talked about, we're also campaigning for the system of civil legal aid to be able to respond to clustered injustice, which James mentioned. So it's just to note that when we think about legal services and how legal services are typically provided, they tend to approach them by looking at one specific area and one specific problem rather than taking, a more global approach. And because of the nature of clustered injustice and the multiple interrelated problems people have, we need the services to be able to, so someone might present with, say, a social welfare problem, but the root cause of the issues might be, an employment law issue that had happened previously, and we need services to be able to react to that. So, for example, a debt issue might also be related to a housing or an employment law issue as well. So as opposed to providing sort of siloed services focused on one area of law, the services we provide need to be, at very least, be able to refer to services where, the root causes can be addressed and even linked in with services, as I mentioned, collaborative service delivery, which can deal with the knock-on effects of those legal problems, but ideally would be able to deal with all of the problems and deal with someone, not just, deal with a case, not just as a distinct legal issue, but deal with the person, and the issues they're encountering, in a broader way.
Thanks, Christopher. If anybody else wants to ask a question, yeah, on the left, in the middle.
Thank you very much. And just as someone who's made more than his share of trips down to Midlands Prison, I know just how important InReach is, so thank you very much for all the work you do there. So it was mentioned, so my name is Michael Kennedy. I'm actually a Green Party representative up in Louth. I wasn't elected, sadly, but local area rep in Drogheda. And one of the issues that was raised was access to political representation, political information within prisons. Such an important aspect that people in Ireland do have the right to vote while in the prison system, but this lack of information and this lack of political representation is a major barrier that needs to be addressed. And I'm kind of curious, for anyone who wants to put input on that, what do you think political parties and political representatives can be doing to be more proactive on making sure people have access to representation?
I might take that very quickly, and if anybody else wants to come in, but I remember Sheila, you put on the conference in Cork, and Michael D. Higgins, president, came down, and he was saying to us that back in the day when he was a councillor, that the lads from Castlereagh prison used to come to him because none of the other politicians would entertain them. And unfortunately, the politicians seem to look after their constituents, the people that will vote, and they're not really interested in. But if we can mobilise people, then all of a sudden they become priority, because now you have a whole lot of people that are informed on who you are and your policy, and they could vote for you or against you. But if you neglect them at your peril. But I think in the absence of apathy, absence of knowledge, there's no real risk, so everybody can ignore. But it just takes somebody then to step out of, it takes a radical politician, basically, to step out and put themselves forward, and they will take a hit amongst their constituents that have zero sympathy for people like us. Remember last week, with all the overdoses that happened in Portlaoise, in Cork we have a radio show, Neil Prendeville. He's like a more moderate version of Niall Boylan. And they were talking about this overdose, and people were ringing in, leave him die. Leave him die. You know what I mean? And it was unchallenged. You know, it takes somebody like yourself to ring up and say, I'm a politician and I stand for these people, and these people are people like me and you. They're from our estates, they have rights like everybody else. And you know, we were talking earlier on, we have people in prisons in Ireland that in another jurisdiction they wouldn't be in prison at all, and it's not black and white, and they deserve representation. But I don't know if anybody else wants to touch on that.
Yeah, I'll just echo what you're saying there, James, about the even to get politicians to go in and speak to prisoners. That would be a great idea, but if you can barely get politicians to come into working class communities, what's the chance of them going into prisons? Do you know, so there needs to be work done at breaking down the stigma that people who use drugs face, but also break down the stigma of people who go into prison, and try and have an understanding of that, like that view of let them die. Like, that's quite a common view in Ireland, and it feeds down through the media how society looks on people who use drugs. I personally think naloxone should be on every landing in the prisons, because let's be real, there are drugs in prison. There's overdoses in prison, and there needs to be a push to actually have that. But there also, on the naloxone piece, there needs to be a push to deregulate it so anyone can get it, that someone doesn't have to be at risk of overdose to get it.
Yeah, and just before we move on from that point, if you look at the civil unrest around the far right and the racism, you know, it's happening in specific communities. Now, I know nearly 100% that if a similar, like if there was 400 refugees went into my community where I'm from, something similar would happen, because they're already very marginalised communities, and people are angry and they're hurt, and then they're looking to vent, and then they get somebody to come in and say it's actually his fault, the brown fella, the black fella. Do you know what I mean? So we had somebody recently was, I won't go into specifics of somebody inside, okay? But the point is, somebody will see the potential in the people in prison, and we want to make sure that it's the people that have right motivations, and not to strengthen the radical groups that may be causing all the civil unrest, because the people from the communities where the civil unrest, they're way overrepresented in the prisons as well, and they're getting out to the same, you know, homelessness and scarce resources, and they can be radicalised unless somebody like yourself goes in and gives more nuance, gives more education, and so something I'd be passionate about anyhow. But does anybody else? I'll come to you next, okay? Sorry, I didn't see you there.
You see me?
Can hear.
I just wanted to ask your opinion on children of prisoners. I know Paula very well. I work in the Northern City in the social inclusion HSE addiction project for families affected by drugs. And my experience is they're nearly non-existent in the prison system. I recently worked with a girl who was doing 6 years, and due to overcrowding, she was released on a Tuesday. She got someone to give a false address, and she ended up in a squat on Pearse Street, back to addiction. Our children are greatly in need, and I work with them. It's just, I don't think they exist. And in other countries around Europe, there's a recognition of attachments, and you know that parents, no matter where they are, they're important to their children. In some prisons in Europe, children stay with their parents for long periods of time. It just, I know when I worked in the Docus years ago, I worked with a child in a prison. Most of the children go into care in Ireland, or to family members who are often very vulnerable and overstretched and under-resourced. So it's just a preventative measure, because often these children become prisoners. And I hate saying that, but often, you know, monkey see, monkey do. And I just think it's more, if we worked more systemically, we might prevent these children entering into the prison system. That's just an opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. And that'd be very close to my heart as well. I remember being a child and my dad going to prison, and then him getting out in my late teens and being a different person when he got out, and all the negative beliefs around the uniform and authority and all them, those were formed. I remember going up to Cork prison, no physical contact, just the chaotic visiting, and then when he went to the training unit in Mountjoy, being able to touch him for the first time in a few years, you know. But no, the bond wasn't the same, do you know what I mean? Somebody I interviewed previously, Lady Edwina Grosvenor, she's in England, but she opened up a facility in England called Hope Street, and it's an alternative to prison for women with children. They can be sentenced to this facility. It's an open facility, and it has psychologists, psychiatrists on site. So there is, as you said, in other jurisdictions, there is other models, you know what I mean? We'll do one more question before we go to tea, okay? Comfort break, sorry, no tea.
Hi, my name is Sarah. My question was actually for Gemma. I was really interested in that initiative that you brought in with the bank, with Portlaoise, and allowing the prisoners obviously access and open bank accounts. Would there be an idea, or has anyone ever looked at that becoming a strategic national initiative?
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, Sarah, so thank you for your question. At the moment, we're setting up in-reach services in other prisons around the country. So, the most recent one was Arbour Hill, and the in-reach staff there encountered the same difficulty as I would have encountered in Midlands prison back some years ago. So, I was assisting them. So I advised them to try and contact local banks in the North Dublin area to try and set up an arrangement between Arbour Hill Prison and a few local banks, so that rather than trying to depend on a hit and miss policy at a higher level, to try and work on the ground, because from my experience, that's how you get your problem solved. You work on the ground, you work from the ground up, not from up here down. So the staff going into Arbour Hill now have set up a contact with a bank in North Dublin. So they will be able to open bank accounts for people who need them now in prison as well. It's so important that the prisoners have access to a bank account, not just alone for the state pension, but we'll just say people will come to us at InReach and they'll say, listen, I'm in a bit of a mess. I have a bank account on the outside. I don't even know the bank account number. How am I going to get the bank account number? So we sit down, we work out with them where the bank was, obviously their personal details like date of birth, their address at the time of opening the account, and with their authority we'll write to that bank and we'll ask, can they provide the prisoner with their bank details. Then we can, on the prisoner's behalf again, with their authority, write back to the bank, and we might ask them to close direct debits that needed to be closed. They might have a card. We might have to ask them to cancel that card, because God knows who has the card on the outside. We have often found that prisoners, when they get their bank statement, discover that their bank account has been cleared out. So it's very important that they have access to their bank, and it would be preferable if they had access to the bank account that they had before they came into prison. Yeah. So it's working on the ground. Yeah, it's working on the ground is so important.
So just to say, in addition to the work that's being done on the ground, at a national level, a draft standard operating procedure has come to the prison's leadership team around supporting prisoners to open bank accounts. And just to say that while it's very important for prisoners to be able to bank independently, there are some security concerns in terms of making sure, I suppose, that the prison service supports the opening of bank accounts in a way that is, number one, secure, and that is, I suppose, like has an AML aspect to it as well, because at the moment one of the challenges with opening a bank account is that your address is a prison. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done, both, as we've said, with the banks, but also from an internal perspective, to make sure that we don't have issues where bank accounts are being opened, but they're being bought. So can you go and open a bank account in your name, and I'll actually operate the bank account for my own potentially criminal purposes? So there are just a balance. There's a balance to be struck there in terms of how we actually operate that. Okay.
Yeah. And just to follow on from that, one of the requirements with the local bank, say in Portlaoise, where we have set up our agreement, is that the person in prison has a verifiable need to open this account, such as qualifying for state pension or something on that line. Yeah, it's tricky and it's difficult, and there are many things to be thought about. There's always the sort of money laundering, criminal aspect side of things that has to be considered as well.